Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's N4 webinar, Beyond Training, How to Incorporate Equity and Hiring Processes to Welcome Newcomers into the Workforce. Before we begin our webinar today, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Mariah, and my role in the N4 team is Partnership and Engagement Lead. I use the pronouns she and her. I will be hosting and moderating the question and answer period of today's presentation. My co-hosts are Colleen Drake and Andrew Tomeyer, who will be monitoring the question, answer, and chat box today. And I am now so pleased to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Anne Curry-Stevens. Dr. Curry-Stevens is a professor of the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University and the founding director of the Center to Advance Racial Equity at the Portland State University. Anne is a longtime researcher and advocate in racial equity and anti-racist organizational change in both Canada and the USA. Her equity work dates back to 1992 in Toronto area NGOs. And then Anne completed her dissertation in pedagogy for the privileged in 2005. Following 3 years at York University, she moved to the USA, where in a faculty position, she worked in deep partnership with the Coalition of Communities of Color as the principal investigator of the 7 reports on racial disparities facing communities of color in the Portland, Oregon area. This work generated urgency to improve racial equity and cultural responsiveness, and she was then able to engage in advocacy work with public and nonprofits. Another stream of her research has been in the distinctive features of ethno-specific organizations, seeking to understand the distinctiveness of the contributions such organizations make to human services. Through this journey, Anne has been generating resources to support organizations, supervisors, and practitioners to engage in their own racial equity journey. In 2017, Anne returned to Canada and has since been leading the racial equity work of Wilfrid Laurier University's Faculty of Social Work. Significant achievements have been generated, and Anne continues research work in this field. Most recently, she has completed a book called The Racial Equity Encyclopedia, Resources for Organizations on the Anti-Racism Journey. Look for it in early 2024. It is a collection of 48 tools to assist your work. And thank you so much, Anne, for joining us and being here today.
I'm very pleased to be able to do so. Thank you for the invitation.
And as a friendly reminder, today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform. We will share this with you as soon as it becomes available. And if there are any technical issues today, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. And before we jump into our presentation today, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our platform to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the question and answer window. And we know that sometimes some of you might have a similar question or be interested in a particular response. So you do have the option of upvoting a question today, and we will prioritize the upvotes based on which questions we ask first. And our speaker today has no conflicts of interest to declare. And with that said, let's jump right into today's presentation. Take it away, Anne.
Thank you so very much. I am just pulling up the PowerPoint I'm using for today, and I make a copy of this available to you as well as a resource sheet to use as you plan for hirings. So today's presentation is very applied and very pragmatic. I have, unlike most academic leanings, I have one sheet on research and the basis for this approach to hiring. I then am going into a series of pieces of advice and a bit of unpacking of some of the challenges that exist with the conventional ways we do things. And then I get very explicit in terms of all of the avenues for hiring practices, from when we begin to think about it and develop job descriptions or think about modifying them, all the way through recruitment, hiring, interviews, and following up. And then we'll wrap with a few pieces of advice for what we do that maximizes the chance of retaining racialized candidates and newcomer candidates to the field and supporting their success in the organizations. So the research to flag with you, this is a very interesting element, is that in the course of a year, a large set, these are American board directors, thought that equity would occur naturally. And close to 3/4. By 2021, only a third think this. So there's been a considerable surge of literacy about what equity work is about, and that it's not just, over time we will change our hiring practices and things, our organizations will diversify. Not true. We need specific approaches to the work. A couple of other pieces to flag is that diverse decision-making groups make better decisions. There's a beautiful phrase that it creates cognitive thinking that improves our consideration of an issue and increases error detection and expands critical thinking. And so there's another quote there that talks about diversity makes you brighter and promotes sharper thinking for everyone. One additional study talked about problem solving becoming much more accurate. So if there's a definitive solution that a diverse group is more than half, again, is likely to make an accurate decision. In the corporate sector, a lot of research into this field has been in corporations and the for-profit arena. And a study of 506 employers found that racial diversity is one of the most important predictors of a company's competitive advantage. And it's not enough just to diversify at the lower down in the organization, but you also need to diversify higher up in the organization to ensure that the benefits are actualized. So that's as much of the foundation in terms of the evidence that says this is an important direction as I'm going to take. I hope it inspires you to think of the value added of diversity in hiring. I hope it affirms the importance to an organization's creativity, problem-solving ability, and if we can draw from the corporate sector and compare ourselves to other healthcare settings, that it should give us some form of competitive advantage. And the areas we're looking at today very explicitly are about the benefits for internal to the organization, so how we improve belonging and inclusion and how we maximize racial equity within the organization, and then the outward facing dimension in terms of how we serve people, our clients, our patients in the work. There are 2 slides we're going to go on to and then do a poll. The first is, so they're just a couple of reminders, a couple of precursors that we really encourage you to do as you begin the hiring process. Take your time and avoid rushing. Rushing is going to reduce attention to equity. It'll reduce expectations for how you develop your candidate pool. If the hiring committee is time pressed and trying to get to, I don't know, 10 candidates in one day, your implicit bias and stereotypes are going to show up more. And you're also going to be inclined to make decisions about trying to hire someone who can hit the ground running. And that's a really important point to pay attention to, because hitting the ground running means that you're going to give priority to somebody the organization already knows, has perhaps already been working part-time in the organization, is likely to know people. So they're also more likely to already share the existing cultural identity of the organization. And so what we need is hiring processes to make sure that sound, deliberate, effective assessments of colleagues and potential colleagues can be made. So that's the first reminder. The second is to aim to know your gaps, to know who you're not serving and who you're not hiring. And those dynamics in terms of an organization that has, we usually refer to them as a dominant culture organization. Sometimes we refer to them as white-centered organizations or a predominantly white organization, is going to have a dominant white workforce. So what you want to do is to know what your starting point is. Where are you underrepresented? Where do you have a pattern of not hiring people into positions that represent the broader community in which you're based? And on the service side, you want to be knowing who you're serving and how effectively you're serving. And so that gives you your own evidence base for the work in moving forwards. So to say, what's the dominant pattern? Where are our gaps in terms of who we're hiring, which then gives you a stronger mission to address the factors that create these kinds of gaps, the causes, the root causes of why these gaps exist. So there's a whole bunch of areas we could go in terms of the equity dimensions to those issues. Today, it's on the hiring to make sure that we're bringing people in ways that reflect the communities and especially those that are being underserved in our organizations. So we're now going to do 2 polls just to see the status of where your organizations are at. So I'll ask Mariah to pull those up. So the first one is, how accurately do you know this data? How accurately do you know the diversity in your organization? So just select one of those. And then the second question is, how strong is your leadership commitment, your leaders of the organization, commitment to hiring a racially diverse workforce? Again, make a single choice there, and we'll take a look at the results. These are really core basic questions for moving equity forwards. Mariah, how long will the poll be open?
About 76% of people have responded. Would you like me to launch the results?
Sure. So most of you have some indicators around the data of your workforce. And most of you, very few of you, have very low commitments to racially diverse hiring. So those are really solid indicators for moving forwards. And as you think this through, I've also provided a worksheet that you can use to prepare yourself for a hiring. And in that area, it says, where are some of your priorities for hiring? And so that would be, you develop insights about those in terms of where are your gaps in your workforce today, and what communities are you not serving very well, or not serving numerically enough of, who's avoiding going to your health service or your organization. So that's just a core basic poll, and it looks like equity issues and initiatives are moving ahead in solid ways in terms of these two approaches. So thank you for doing that. I'm now going to, can I get control back, Mariah? Oh, yep. For some reason, it's frozen. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start with the job posting. And the slides for today's approach look like this. I'm going to focus on the right-hand column. So the way I've organized this is, what's the element we're paying attention to? What's the barrier? And what's the remedy? And so by starting, to go through all of the details, I wanted to give you these details so you can use it as a resource in your own organizations. And to move through this fairly smoothly, I think it will be best to focus on the remedies. So I'm going to pick and choose a little bit from the elements and the barriers, and spend a bit more time on the remedies. So the first element is, we often say something like, we encourage all eligible candidates to apply. That's a undifferentiated appeal. And what we need to do instead is to say something like this: we encourage BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that's what BIPOC stands for, and international candidates to apply. And here's the rationale: as we aim to deepen our connection to the range of communities we serve. The next area, if we move down on the right-hand column, our starting wage is from $40 to $45 an hour, depending on prior experience, or you might post that as a salary range. There is way too much suppressing of pay ranges, and it makes the process infused with a ton of uncertainty, and it's an experience where candidates don't know if they can live on the wage, especially in a situation where you're looking at international candidates who who may not know the standards for the field they're looking at. And within the standards, there is a ton of variation. The third one I wanted to draw attention to is about a criminal reference check is required. And there have been campaigns in the US and Canada on this. It deters a wide range of candidates from applying. And a policy like that, if you know there are racial disparities in policing, in court practices, in findings of guilt, in lengths of sentences, in forgiveness of one's criminal record, that there is a huge racial bias against racialized people in that very policy. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't do this, but instead you should not do the check until you've decided you're interested in hiring them. And then you talk to your preferred candidate where they're able to explain their record. Maybe their record is for smoking cannabis, which is no longer illegal and seems to be an unfair dual standard for candidates who may have been caught earlier versus candidates who may be smoking pot today. Or it may be that they have been through a huge amount of treatment and recovery and no longer have a specific challenge that gave rise to the criminal reference. Or maybe it was because they were engaged in civil disobedience, protesting some injustice that existed with immigration policy, for example. And so aim to differentiate as opposed to that broad sweep around a criminal reference check, and to make sure that you're really clear what types of criminal activity, criminal convictions are appropriately tied to denying somebody the position. Without it, a huge swath of people won't apply in ways that are going to limit the pool you've got. The second job posting element is that we often ignore a focus on our effort to integrate equity into services. So without it, you're going to be hiring people who don't have this as a priority. There's a small chance they do, but if you instead say, and here's the example, successful candidates must be committed to working effectively with diverse community populations and expected to strengthen such capacity if hired. You're signaling that you're doing serious work and that it's ongoing work in this area. So that's that outward focused goal. Now look at the inward focused parallel around an organizational equity commitment. And so if we're naming this as an objective, it would read something like, the organization's committed to racial equity across the organization, in our services to clients, in our workforce composition and practices, and in our organizational culture. While still seeking to improve our demonstration of this commitment, candidates should know that racial equity is a cornerstone of our commitment to communities in the region. Doesn't that sound great? The other piece that does is it doesn't overpromise. It says while still seeking to improve, because it becomes an issue to get frustrated about if you promise that this is a cornerstone, and that we have done this and that we live our commitment to racial equity. If you don't put something that says we're still on this as a journey, it can lead to considerable disillusionment of your participants, of your candidates, sorry. So we're now going to shift away from the posting and more to the job description itself. And while we're doing this in the approach that's tied to how do you hire, and so you'd be reviewing the job description before you post it to hire. In many cases, and in many other cases, you're just repeating and filling in for somebody who's left, and so you're just hiring to fill that gap. It's really important to update job descriptions when you have the opportunity. So the job description is the more durable dimension of the work. And there are a number of areas that we give heightened attention to. And so I have a number of slides on this. So the first is on credentials. We often say you need Canadian job experience. And I ask the question, why? Why can't you just say, we want relevant job description and omit Canadian from that statement? We often hire people who have high levels of education because we've asked for a master's degree in X, Y, or Z, or an undergrad degree plus experience, for example. Know again that there's an ongoing barrier because of the cost of education and because of the cost that the education has considerable racial bias in it. And so our BIPOC candidates or potential candidates are less likely to have gotten into and successfully out of higher education. And so that kind of standard can become a racialized barrier and can very definitely be a class barrier for people who can't afford it. So wherever possible, you want to reduce the emphasis on a high level of education. Two ways to do it is to replace some of the education with related experience. Another way is to value lived experience as legitimate qualification. So think of the area, excuse me, of something like providing healthcare for homeless populations. And you're valuing a high level of education. Wouldn't you see that somebody who's been homeless and has had some experience would be able to engage with and connect with homeless people, would not shudder at the smells of unwashed clothing, would be able to sit and share a meal, would be able to walk into homeless camps to provide services? Would that not be an extraordinary qualification to work in such a setting? And so not only are you trying to reduce that education, but you're trying to add and integrate lived experience as a legitimate qualification. The other piece is that without sort of explicit invitation, we typically write our job descriptions to Canadian candidates and credentials. So think about adding an explicit invitation that credentials and experience from outside Canada are welcomed. I think that would be a beautiful addition to signal welcome. And please know there's been research on who applies for positions depending on the posting and the job description. And it is very likely that racialized candidates are going to self-exclude, and international candidates are going to exclude themselves, where there's this high Canadian emphasis in how the position is drafted. And instead, they're going to turn to organizations, and this is some of that competitive advantage dynamic. They're going to turn to organizations that seem to be hard at work, that speak to their experience, that normalize the importance of diversity and the assets that they're going to bring into the organization. They're going to self-select on the basis of how welcoming and how inclusive your language is. Our next dimension of the job description is around collegiality and teamwork. And the two areas I've prioritized here is experience working in a cross-cultural team and, excuse me, addressing anti-racism as it emerges. So the two remedies, and again, these could be statements in your job description, that you would come with the qualifications of being experienced with cross-cultural teams, demonstrated affirmation of all team members and ensuring that team members' perspectives have influence. So it's not just hearing from everybody, but making sure that they have some influence on the decision. That's some of those benefits of a diverse workforce. In the areas of anti-racism, address anti-racism, that you have a quality of addressing and experience of addressing racism as it occurs, including interrupting it, engaging in advocacy, and bringing concerns to leadership. Just before I go on, these will be elements ideally that you can grow into, that you can increasingly add to your work in this area. It's not expected that you're going to revise your job description and your hiring process and reflect all of these. You're going to assess where you can push, where you can make improvements, and see it as a 5-year journey that you're going to be growing into these capacities across time. Then we're going to move and look at, a second. There we go. Look at the organizational dimensions. And again, you want to be really clear that a candidate in their job description is expected to actively support the equity journey of the organization and related action plans that guide practice. Most equity work ends up developing action plans, usually in each organizational unit. So finance would have its equity action plan. HR and personnel would have their own. Frontline services that are based in Ottawa is going to have its own, whereas if they're providing services in Perth, they're going to have their own action plan. And so I encourage you to stretch that statement around active support of the journey to also say, and to support the action plans that guide practice. The next area we're going to talk about is personal development. So this needs to be a lifelong commitment to improving our ability to notice injustice, to address it, and to develop alternatives. And so we really want to flag that this is ongoing work, and that we want to have high expectations for how people, so we want to have high expectations in our job description for successful candidates to be guided and then to be held accountable through performance evaluations, through probationary reviews, through merit pay increases, through promotions, to have some kind of understanding that they're doing equity and have been doing equity in their role in the organization. So some of the strategies would be to say that, to ask somebody to develop an understanding of how power influences organizational and patient experiences. Because racism is a power imbalance between typically white powerful people in the organization, power holders, and racialized people who tend to come in on the margins of the organization and live a more marginal experience in the organization. And so paying attention and developing an understanding of power is really important, both organizationally and for patients. The next one, continuously unlearn implicit biases and relearn more accurate understandings of communities other than one's own. And a third possibility, continue learning of how one's social location, so your gender, race, class, sexual orientation, etc., influences one's experiences in the workplace and more broadly in society. Then the final slide in this area about the job description, and please know not all sections have this many slides. We're now going to focus on the cognate areas, which is really about the substantive, role-specific, what's exclusive function you're filling in the organization. And so the kinds of things we want to write in are community knowledge, community engagement, equity awareness in services. Low social distance speaks to capacity to engage with service users, with patients, and building services that are more culturally responsive. And so there's suggested language for each of those. Essentially, the focus here is to really tap into the assets that somebody with lived experience has of the communities that you're underserving. And so an example is holds deep understanding of the culture, history, and current service challenges of local communities. And I'll read the second one and then just discuss it for a second. Has community connections and experiences that can help link the organization to communities that are underserved. And so you're identifying the assets. And when Mariah said, I've been studying ethno-specific organizations and what's the unique character and assets that those organizations bring, it's some of these features that they hire from the communities that they're serving. And people have a pronounced, more organic asset in these areas. This isn't to say that white people can't develop this, but there's going to be a more organic feel that's gathered through lived experience of hiring community members, people who have grown up or people who have spent considerable time as a racialized member or as a newcomer and understands newcomer experiences for the organization. And I'll just read the second last one on the right-hand side, that the candidate or in the job description, that somebody would share lived experiences with underserved communities that promotes understanding, connection, trust, and deep investments in patient and community well-being. White people can develop this, but it's going to be more organic and palpable with somebody who's from the community. They're also going to have tied futures, that it's not a matter of empathizing with the community that's struggling, but you're actually part of it. And so the community's well-being is part of your own well-being. So that concept of holding tied futures is very important. Excuse me. Recruitment. Think about the access of the posting. And so the real core focus is to find out where non-dominant people get their news. Another idea is to offer stipends for successful referrals by existing staff, and to think about working upstream with higher education and asking for referrals, but also signal to them that the vitality in your ability to do racial equity work and serve newcomers better is going to depend on them training BIPOC and newcomer students more fully. And so if the more we can give that voice to higher education, the more seriously they're going to pay attention to it. So if you don't have a diverse pool, ideally you delay until you do. And you ideally want 2 or more diverse candidates. If there's only one diverse candidate in the pool, this is more likely to activate our bias because they're going to stand out more as being different. And it's going to reduce the likelihood that they get hired. So we're just going to tune in for a second or two on what it might be like to walk into an interview as a BIPOC or an international candidate. The concerns are going to be, will I fit in? Will I be welcomed and wanted? Will I have support? Will I be able to move up? And so the kinds of responses to address this is just have some informal time with the candidates to demonstrate that kind of welcome and to share the kinds of supports that exist for racialized and newcomer candidates. And you may want to reach out. You may want to have members of a BIPOC caucus or a BIPOC, somebody who would be their colleague in the organization, have lunch with them or have some time with them where they can ask questions about the equity status and the kinds of welcome they might expect in the organization. So the hiring committee, it's very important to think about its racial composition, to make sure that somebody has the background of the candidates that you're hiring in the group, or to study up on that. Internalized biases, implicit biases are going to show up in the process. So one of the things that's important to do is to do and to require of all members to do an anti-bias training and to make sure that everybody attends that. You're also wanting to make sure that there's some equity capacity on the hiring committee, and that's easy to add somebody who's got this background, who's maybe a part of an existing equity or cultural competency committee, even if it's a community member. It's important to add. It's also key to regularize and to structure interviews. So to have a scoring system for each of your questions and to rate, to have an explicit rating spectrum where you, and there's one suggested here, in terms of how you might appoint grades to different parts of the process. The hiring committee's practices are really important because it's going to show up and it's going to disadvantage some candidates and unfairly benefit others. And so some of the remedies are to have a culture that's brave, that you can confront each other if somebody notices bias showing up. You want to review the job description. So the more you stay grounded in the job description, the less you're going to deviate to other factors that are going to influence your decision. If you do anti-bias training, post some of those key messages to remind yourself and use that grading rubric to award points. So another dynamic, there are two dynamics to pay attention to that are important. One is that we often diverge and focus on the bells and whistles, the extra value added that somebody might bring that aren't what you're looking for. And somebody needs to notice this and point it out to everyone, that we aren't hiring for somebody who can do a web-based, we're hiring for a service, and we start talking about, well, they can do a newsletter for us. They've got really great layout skills. Stop that dynamic from happening. The other piece is a good fit hiring, and I'll speak more about that in a minute. So the decisions need to be clear. This is a restatement of some of the elements you've got in already. I'm just going to pay attention to the last item. Please aim to develop a culture where you're giving feedback to unsuccessful candidates. If they don't know, especially BIPOC and international candidates, if they don't know what their weak areas, they'll likely remain weak candidates. And that might be a greater feature of the interview as opposed to their credentials and their capacities to do the job. So think about it as helping to overcome the biases of your interview practices if you're helping nudge them in those ways. So I'm aware that we are wanting to leave considerable time for some questions. So I'm not going to go through the interview questions, but I want you to notice that we've got cultural questions over on the right-hand side, cognate focused questions as part B. Part C is collegial work. Share an example of someone you had conflict with that was related to equity and inclusion. Share your actions and identify what you might do differently today. So usually we'll ask a conflict question, but it won't have anything to do with equity and inclusion. And so be explicit about hiring in ways that prioritize these issues. The final couple of slides I think I want to emphasize are the elements for newcomers.